This is a conversation with Michael Hirsh, a columnist for the Foreign Policy magazine and one of the most experienced reporters on U.S. foreign policy and national security. And in this episode, we look at a big claim that he's been making, that realism, the idea that international relations are a zero-sum game where states don't have allies or values, just competitors and interests, has quietly rose from the fringes to the mainstream. And that today, this is the dominant way of thinking about America's role in the world across both parties, and one that's here to stay. We talk about why and when did this shift happen, whether Donald Trump's administration is really driven by realism, isolationism, pure chaos, or something else. Where do people like J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, and others stand on this, and why he thinks that the Democratic Party is shifting in this direction too. And finally, we talk about what this means for the rest of the world, for Ukraine and for Russia, for Europe and NATO, and for the US-China competition and Taiwan, and how all of this could shape the next decade of US foreign policy. This podcast and interviews like this can exist only thanks to its supporters on Patreon, to whom I'm deeply grateful and who get a bunch of perks in return for their support, including the full ad-free version of this and other episodes and additional bonus content. And if you want to get more geopolitical analysis to help you filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, I also write a newsletter where I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns. You can find the link for that in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. Okay, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So we are going to be talking about realism and its comeback to the U.S. foreign policy, which is something that you have written about. And I think that it's such an interesting observation and analysis that I think it deserves a special episode. But before we get to what are actually the consequences and the reasons for why that is happening, let's maybe start by explaining what do we mean by realism when we talk about it, or rather when you talk about it.
Sure. Well, the concept of realism in international relations, I think, can only be understood when opposed to the opposite idea, which is the idea of liberal internationalism that developed after World War I. In particular, Woodrow Wilson was seen as the originator, and then was realized more fully after World War II by Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman in the creation of the international system and international institutions like the United Nations. By contrast, realism is the idea that international law doesn't really apply in international relations, that really what makes the only difference in terms of relations between countries is the exercise of power, military, economic, technological power, and how successfully you exert that power. That's basically the idea behind realism. And what we're seeing is, a sort of new realization, I think, among both political parties in Washington that that should be the way forward far more than what has been depended on for the last 80 years.
So you or I would probably say that to an extent, realism has always been present in Washington. Some scholars or think tank people were always advocating for a more realistic approach to foreign policy, and you probably had elements of realist foreign policy throughout the past decades as well. But it probably never had such a strong presence in the policymaking circles as it does now. So I don't know if you would agree with that, but if you do, when do you think that this rise of realism and its comeback to the main stage, when do you think it happened? How did it start? And what are the reasons for this new popularity of this type of thinking?
Well, I think in the aftermath of the Cold War, there was initially a hope that this sort of UN-centered international system could continue to dominate. And in fact, of course, during the Cold War, which was a very realist confrontation between two superpowers, you saw international law in abeyance, basically. It was much more a realist conflict. But again, there was a brief period, particularly in the first Gulf War, when President George H.W. Bush sought a UN Security Council resolution, sought to impose the idea of international law on relations between countries after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And there was, a remarkable unanimity among major nations that should be enforced and international law should be enforced. And then what happened gradually was that I think the United States began to abuse that role. And you saw that particularly with the invasion of Iraq by George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, which even though he did try to go through the United Nations, essentially was a unilateral act and did not have the support of a lot of the world. And so I think you began to see the disintegration of the sort of post-war system starting at that point. And then, of course, it began to disintegrate for various other reasons. There was a lack of support among the U.S. public for this system. There was a sense that the U.S. was being exploited by the rest of the world, that we were expected to be, the sort of global policeman, and that everyone else could sort of stint on their defense spending, particularly Europe. I mean, these are all complaints you've heard, more recently from Donald Trump, but he was not the first. So I think there was just eroding support among the American public for this role. And that's why, in brief, you're seeing the rise of a new realism in Washington.
So if we're talking about realism being the dominant force today in Washington, does that mean that you would say that the current U.S. administration, the second Trump's administration, would you call the foreign policy of this administration a realist one? And would you say that Donald Trump is a realist in foreign policy?
I don't think that Trump has studied enough foreign policy or understands the history of the last 80 years well enough to, classify himself as a realist. But certainly the people who work for him in his administration see themselves that way, among whom I would name particularly Elbridge Colby, who's the Undersecretary for Policy in the Defense Department, or the newly named War Department now, who I spoke with last year in a series of interviews, and he basically said that the debate inside Washington, inside the Republican Party, was between the old primacists, as he called it, those who believe in U.S. hegemony and dominance in the international system, and the new realists, as he called them, who want to advocate more for restraint, want to see other countries pick up the burden of defense, particularly in Europe, but also in East Asia. And so that really, was where the debate began to go. And I think even within the Trump administration now, you see a struggle between the old line Republican hawks, the Lindsey Grahams, the Tom Cottons of the party, who continue to believe that the U.S. should play a dominant role, and the new restrainers, as they're called, or the realists, like Colby. And they tend to be a younger generation that I think came of age, not so much, in the triumphalism of the post-Cold War era, when there was a sense that, American universal rules along the lines of American democracy and liberal capitalism were going to apply to the rest of the world. Instead, we've seen people who were of a younger generation, say in their 40s or early 50s, who came of age realizing all the errors that sort of undermine that concept. And so I think that's kind of the debate that you're seeing right now.
I think that you mentioning Elbridge Colby is an interesting insight, because he is an interesting figure, because he is someone who is often spoken about in connection to a lot of quite major policy decisions that the U.S. and Pentagon have been taking. But at the same time, he is an undersecretary, if I'm not mistaken, which is an influential position, but usually not the person who actually makes the decision. So I'm just wondering if this view is really as dominant in the administration, or if it's more about, some people who really believe it are able to push through these ideas quite successfully.
Yeah, well, his role is actually the number three in the Pentagon under Defense Secretary Hegseth and the Deputy Defense Secretary. But he's seen as enormously influential within Republican circles, within the administration. Yes, you're right. There has been a lot of back and forth. And in fact, Elbridge Colby lost a key policy fight over the Iran crisis over the summer when, in spite of a lot of skepticism by those within the administration who might be called restrainers, including Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Trump decided to join the Israeli attack on Iran. And during that struggle, Colby was someone who did not want to send an additional carrier group to the Middle East. He's wanted to withdraw from the Middle East, and he lost that particular fight. But there was also a serious question about whether this represented any kind of a long-term victory for the so-called hawks, or whether this was sort of a one-off. And many people believe it, was a one-off, that Trump just decided to jump in because he saw the Israelis having such dramatic success against the Iranians.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important, but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. And do you think that Trump in this situation is more of a deciding on a case-to-case basis what sounds like might make sense in the moment, rather than having some kind of a more unified view that would guide his foreign policy decisions?
I think that Trump's view consistently, and this goes really back to the late 1980s, when he first began to become politically active. He took out a full-page ad in the New York Times and other newspapers, for example, inveighing against Japan's trade practices. At that time, of course, Japan was seen as the rising, alternative superpower, not China. But the grievances were much the same. It was basically, here is Japan that is under our defense umbrella and is exploiting our goodwill, that is the U.S. goodwill, and taking advantage of us in our markets and with unfair trade. So I think in a consistent sense, Trump's philosophy, if you will, has been one of grievance, in a sense that the rest of the world has exploited the United States. And that's not, a traditional realist philosophy, but it has worked to the realist's advantage on the Republican side in that up until, say, George W. Bush, the last Republican president, you did have a consistent dominance by the so-called primicists, those who believe that the U.S. has to maintain a dominant position in the international system and continue to run the international system, and that to a certain extent, depended on international law. So I think there's been a dramatic change under Trump, but not necessarily because Trump's philosophy is a realist one. It's just that he's enabled the realists to come to the fore.
Right. I would say that, to me, the foreign policy under Trump also seems, maybe more than anything, it just seems like pure chaos, and that that's basically how I would define it. And I'm not sure, or I would see realism as having quite clearly defined interests and then pursuing them in a very selfish way. And I'm not sure that the Trump administration in foreign policy knows exactly what those interests or goals are. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Well, I think that you're right about Trump himself. I mean, this is a very impulsive guy who tends to filter everything, including world affairs, through his, peculiar brand of narcissism, as we know. Many Republicans see him as a unique political quantity for that reason, as I say in my article. And I think if you want to see the future of Republican Party foreign policy, and indeed possibly to some extent U.S. foreign policy, you have to look at J.D. Vance, who's 41 years old. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, is only 53. These are the people that really represent the future of the party, and you want to look at their views. And I think that their views have consistently been realist in the sense that, as Rubio said during his confirmation hearings, the international system has really not worked in the long run for the United States. We've tended, that is, U.S. politicians have tended for too long to put the primacy of the system, the success of the system, first, and U.S. national interests second. Now, many of us, including myself, would argue that the interests of the international system, if it's done right, actually work in the U.S. advantage, to the U.S. advantage, because the United States then gets to stay, the dominant power in the world. We don't see rising rival powers like China. But I would also agree that many errors have been made by Washington policymakers that have allowed China and Russia and other countries to present themselves as alternative sources of authority. But anyway, to get back to the main point, I don't think to see the future of American foreign policy, you want to really look at Trump himself. The guy is 79. This is almost certainly going to be his last hurrah. You really want to look at the younger generation coming forward, particularly someone like Vance, the vice president. And they are definitely of a very realist, pro-restrainer view that wants to retreat from this traditional post-war role of the U.S. as global policeman.
Right. I have seen Vance basically since at least this administration started, but even before that, as someone who is probably the most aligned with this type of thinking. And I always thought that if Europe is unhappy with Trump, which I think we quite are, we would be a lot more unhappy with J.D. Vance as president, perhaps following Trump, and probably a lot of other other countries would see, or my assumption is that we would see the U.S. withdrawing and retreating from the world and from the international order a lot more than under Trump. Would you agree with that?
I think certainly there are indications of that. If you recall, I think the huge shock to European sensibilities was Vance's speech back in February, right? And in Munich, he essentially began chastising European governments. He appeared to, essentially rebuff the whole idea of a successful European Union that was a U.S. ally. He actually cuddled up to, alternative for Deutschland, the ostensibly neo-Nazi or at least far right group in Germany. There's a sense among hardline right-wing Republicans like Vance that the European Union is essentially a liberal enterprise that aligns itself automatically with the Democratic Party. It's very political. And I, for one, saw that Vance speech and a lot of what Vance has said since then as kind of the opening of his 2028 campaign. I don't think he was addressing the Europeans as much as he was addressing the MAGA, audience back in the United States. I think almost everything that Vance says and does these days is really about 2028 because he sees himself as the heir to this era of Trumpism. So yes, if I were European, I would be extremely concerned. And I would also be working very hard, as it seems some European politicians are, to create a much more independent and autonomous Europe, because that's going to be the only alternative.
Yeah. I was there in Munich, and I was thinking exactly the same thing, that the speech was primarily meant for U.S. audiences rather than for anyone in Europe. And I agree that I think that as Europe, we should be concerned about the prospect of J.D. Vance presidency, because it wouldn't probably be very good for us. But I wanted to talk about the other person you've mentioned, Marco Rubio, because I always saw him as more of a before this administration, as someone who maybe used to be more what you call a primacist and more traditional, U.S. foreign policy hawk, and it seems that he's kind of changed. At least I don't know if you would agree with that perception.
Completely agree.
Yeah,
Actually, it's a very insightful observation on your part, because yes, a generation ago is when he started in politics. Rubio was seen as a traditional Republican hawk, aligned with, say, the Lindsey Grahams and others of that ilk. And he has transformed himself. He is a political chameleon who has sort of, as he, I'm sure, would see it, seen the light, of the MAGA movement and aligned himself fully with Trump. In fact, it's interesting because among a lot of Washington observers in the run-up to the Trump administration, there were articles saying, well, I wonder how long Marco Rubio can last, because he's not really with these guys. He's not a traditional, he's not a MAGA guy. Well, he's turned out to be, so much a MAGA guy that Trump not only made him a Secretary of State, he's now, effectively National Security Advisor. You'll notice that since Trump fired Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, he's basically hasn't replaced him, and he's made Rubio, given him that role. So, Rubio, where he's come from, where he is now, is, I think, a really, really effective illustration, a vivid illustration of where the party has gone, the Republican Party, and where it's likely to stay, frankly, in the future.
yeah. I was thinking that it supports your thesis looking at him, because he probably sensed where the times are going and decided to just adapt to that. So it would support the argument that it is becoming the dominant mainstream thinking in Washington. One thing that I want to talk about, though, is that you sort of use realist foreign policy and restrained as one and the other. But looking at it, being a realist doesn't necessarily always mean choosing restraint, right? On the contrary, if you believe that all the other states are trying to pursue their interests and hurt yours at the same time, if you withdraw from the world completely and just give them a free rein to be able to just pursue their interests, that should eventually hurt you if that's your vision of the world. So
Exactly.
It kind of seems that being very focused on restraint doesn't actually seem that realist to me, and maybe that the people are more that a lot of people in the administration, maybe some of them are more leaning towards slight isolationism and restrainism rather than pure realism. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's right. And I think that's actually a good segue into where the Democratic Party is going. As I say in my article, and the main reason I wrote my article is because I was talking to some of these younger Democrats who now proclaim themselves to be realists. And they are very forthright in saying that, there are still significant differences between their realism and the realism you're seeing in, the Elbridge Colbys and J.D. Vances on the other side. And a lot of that has to do with the idea, as Rebecca Listner, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor to Kamala Harris, the former Vice President, and who's one of the leading thinkers on the Democratic side, as she said to me in an interview, there is a very significant difference in that they want to continue to project American power, particularly in support of Ukraine against Russia, but also they're much more forthright in maintaining a strong U.S. role in deterring China, say, from invading or dominating Taiwan, and they do see that as an important U.S. role. The difference from where their predecessors were, the Wilsonians, if you will, the whole, tradition of FDR and Truman, the difference is that they don't see international law or international trade rules and regulations as being decisive. They think that the U.S. has to exercise power. It has to use its technological, military, and economic power to get its way, which is very much a realist view. So that's really the difference. But you're right. I mean, you can't. It's one should not make synonymous the idea of realism and restraint. And that, in fact, is where you're seeing the biggest difference in the two parties. Whereas, as I'm saying, you have among the Republicans this desire to withdraw. Some of them are sort of neo-isolationists. Others, want to maintain U.S. power and U.S. presence in the world, but they want to ratchet it back, and they want the Europeans and the East Asians to take up more of the burden. Whereas the Democrats are much more the Democratic realists are much more vociferous about saying that the U.S. should continue to have its preeminent role.
Maybe to follow up on that, I would say that one of the arguments of many of the people that we were talking about, especially someone like Elbridge Colby, is that, or was that, the U.S. needs to restrain itself in other parts of the world because it has one major challenge now that it needs to focus all its resources on because it doesn't have enough of them, which is China. And
Right.
that's the argument for why the realist and restrained foreign policy should be the new direction. But to me, and I would love to hear your view, it kind of now seems in this administration that focus on China and seeing it as a challenge and putting the resources there is also now taking a back seat. If you look at, for example, the new national defense strategy that is supposed to include deprioritization of that and focusing more on the Western Hemisphere and domestic challenges. So what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question, Dominic. The truth is that 8 months plus into the Trump administration, we do not have any kind of a clear policy direction when it comes to China. Yes, there is a general recognition that China is the number one strategic competitor to the United States by far. But if you look at Trump's policies, it is mostly focused on trade, starting up a trade war again, which he's then had to retreat from partly because, to to his surprise, China was much more in control of critical minerals and other areas of high-tech manufacture that were essential to not only the U.S. economy, but the U.S. defense system, such as, for example, rare earths. So that's remained kind of a muddle. The very high tariffs remain on China. But when it comes to the U.S. policy toward Taiwan specifically, it remains kind of a large question mark. There are some indications that the Trump administration is going to be taking a somewhat milder view of China's right, if you will, to regional hegemony in East Asia and its sphere of influence in East Asia, which could include its treatment of Taiwan. Getting back to Elbridge Colby, for example, some of the things he said in the past to Taiwan is, you guys need to really take control more of your own defense. And it's not clear whether the U.S. policy is sort of evolving into something that is going to really pressure Taiwan to depend on itself for its own defense, which could be a huge problem for Taiwan. But we don't have a lot of clarity on that. Again, part of it is just the sheer incoherence of Trump's approach to world affairs. Again, it goes back to his sense of grievance. It goes back to his sense that this is about economics, even though he doesn't seem to understand economics very well at all, since he sees, trade deficits essentially as like equivalent to corporate losses and surpluses as equivalent to profits, which of course is nonsensical. So it's very, very difficult to say where they are going on that question. I think that there is a consistency in the U.S. view that the U.S. has to stay involved, should maintain its alliances. You see Trump, after a lot of back and forth over his first term and now over the U.S. role in NATO, you see Trump saying, well, we're going to continue to support NATO. Certainly, Trump has come out and said, we want to maintain the alliance with Japan, which is central in East Asia, and with South Korea. But at the same time, he's put a lot of pressure on those countries on the tariff issue. So it remains a muddle. I mean, really, it's very difficult to say.
I know that it's an extreme speculation, but I'm sure that you have some sense of what you think the U.S. would do if during this administration they were forced to make a decision whether they would defend Taiwan or not. What do you think if we would, and obviously no one knows, so it's a speculation, but what's your sense would happen? Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you. Since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.